Hello everyone, and it's time to delve into one of the more controversial topics in C# development, and that's implicitly typed local variables and using the var keyword. I am not here to argue for using it or against using it, but it seems to be a bone of contention amongst developers, and there are different coding styles that lend to using var or lend to not using var. So what are implicitly typed local variables? These are variables that you can declare without explicitly specifying the type of the variable, and instead letting the compiler decide what the variable's type is during compilation or just-in-time compilation. It's better to see an example, so let's go to it. Before we go into how this can be used with arrays, let's just kind of go back to week 1, week 2, and talk about variable declaration. So maybe I wanted to declare a string, day 0 equals Sunday. And I can take that and write it to the screen. Well, I don't want to write that. Let's write day 0. All right. So what have I done here? I've declared a variable day 0 of type string. I've initialized it to the value of the string Sunday. So when I go and write this to the screen, it's going to show Sunday. Perfect. We all know this works. Instead of always having to specify the type on a variable, you can use a keyword called var. And what var says is to the compiler, I'm going to declare this variable, but based on the value I set to the variable when I initialize it, you determine the type. So here, if I type in var day 0 and I set it to Sunday, this is going to, in the background, set day 0 to be a string. Now, you cannot just simply change the type of it willy-nilly. It is a string, no matter what. But instead of constantly writing string or int or double or foo or whatever, you can use a var instead. So for instance, if I were to declare an integer, my int, and set it to 4, I could easily just use var, my int, set it to 4, and the compiler would automatically say that's an integer and would treat it as an integer in the rest of the code that you use. So in essence, var can be used in place of a type. Now, there are caveats to this. It can only be used in a code block. You cannot, for instance, write a method and use var as a type of a parameter. You cannot do that. You also, let's say this was int, you also cannot use it as a return type. That is a no-no as well. It can only be used within a method, within a block of code, within a method, but not in a method definition or a class definition or a property definition, which you will not get to in this course. Well, we may in the last week. But suffice it to say, it can only be used in a code block inside of a method. Now, how does this pertain to arrays? When we talked about a for each loop, days of week, and we define this to be Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday. Exciting, isn't this? Friday, Saturday. And we created an array like this. And then we iterated through the array for each string, day, and days, days of week. What we did here was we created a string array, days of week, 7 members of this array. The element values are Sunday through Saturday, indices 0 through 6. And then we used a for each loop to iterate through each day, each string day in days of week, and write it to the screen. So run this and show you. Okay, it's the same as our previous lessons. Traditionally, var is used to iterate through IEnumerable objects or arrays. Again, you don't have any idea what an IEnumerable object is, but it is used in terms you do know to iterate through an array. So in many times when you're seeing other people's code, you will see var used in a for each. Basically saying, I may not know what this is, but compiler, you know what this is, so I'm just going to use the var keyword instead of explicitly defining the type. Now you may say, well, that's stupid. We know it's a string. However, once you start getting into interface definitions, classes using specific interfaces, you want to let the compiler determine which is the best common interface between all the types in an array or an enumerable object to decide. So var, you will see, traditionally used in a for each loop. Also, we could use var up here too. Again, I talked about replacing an array. Now you're not going to be able to use it using the explicit definition of an array here. Because why? Well, the compiler doesn't really know this is a string array unless we've explicitly said string when we use this form of initializer syntax. So if you want to use var to define an array, you're going to have to explicitly say it's a new string of length 7. It's why it's really not used for array definitions. But going back, it is used in for each loops. So if we run this code again, you will see it does the exact same thing. I bring this up not because you should be using this right now. You should be declaring your types explicitly on your variables. At this point in your programming career, using var, except in a for each loop definition, is bad practice because you should be well aware of the types that you're using. However, you should be familiar that var is used. Sometimes it's used incorrectly, sometimes it's used too little, sometimes it's used too much. In my personal opinion, I won't get into the fight over whether or not var should be used regularly or not, which probably isn't the most exciting existential fight out there, but it is one. var, it's acceptable to use var if the focus on code readability is business logic and not the specific types of the code. So for instance, if you're parsing at the airport, we get flight data, and we have well-defined variable names. I have XML data coming in with flight number. I have XML data coming in with whether or not a flight was diverted. I have clear variable name definitions in my parser. And it is okay, because in your mind, when you see flight number, it's going to be an integer. When you see airline code, industry-wide, you know that's going to be a mixed string. It is perfectly acceptable to use var when writing those parsers. However, if you are writing code for readability outside of a common industry business purpose, you should be clearly defining the types of your variables. So there's my rant on using var or not, but you should know it is there. You should know what you can use it for. You should know the limitations of it. And you will see some code using var. But traditionally, in terms of this course, I will accept you using var in a for each loop, because you will use it later on when talking about enumerable objects. So there's my rant for the week. Hope you're excited to learn about var. Choose a side. You may be asked at some point in your development career to pick one. So see you next lesson.